Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org. This episode of Acton Line was recorded at Acton University, our flagship conference. Acton University is a 4-day exploration of theology, philosophy, entrepreneurship, international development, and market-based economics. Each day is filled with thought-provoking presentations on the intellectual and practical foundations of a free society. At Acton University, you can sharpen your intellect, expand your worldview, and learn the foundations of genuine human flourishing. To learn more, visit university.acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute, and today I'm joined by Isaac Willour, who oversees shareholder engagement at Bowyer Research, America's leading pro-fiduciary proxy consulting firm. On Isaac's most recent appearance on Acton Line, we talked about DEI. But after that show wrapped, Isaac and I started, the B-roll kept rolling.
Oh, yeah.
And we kept having this conversation, and it turned to ESG. And I said at the time, I'm like, Isaac, we're going to be transitioning to a video podcast. We got to have you back when we get the video up and rolling.
Had to get the hair down. And we had
hair down, hair high and tight.
That's right.
In my case, but we are ready, and the hair is
it's a high ponytail.
The hair is beautiful, or like what is of the hair is beautiful, and we're ready to go. I'm freshly sunned from the beach, so
I am too. You wouldn't know it, but
yeah. Welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Dan, thanks for having me back.
What is ESG? When we talk about these acronyms become sort of second nature to everybody who follows reporting on this, who follows the corporate world. But there's a lot of people that don't do those things. So just to bring people up to speed, what is this ESG, and what does it look like in the corporate world?
Yeah, it's one of those. I do have those moments, right? You'd ask people about these acronyms, and everyone kind of knows what DEI is because it's been in the news cycle constantly. We've been talking about it all the time. But then you talk about DEI and ESG, and people kind of get this blank stare, like, what's ESG? So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And generally, it's used to describe factors in a corporation's performance that are outside of shareholder return, right?
Yep.
So
and profit and loss.
Right.
Yep.
Right. So let's take ExxonMobil, right?
Mm-hmm.
ExxonMobil does business in the oil and gas. Now, some people have problems with that. We'll get into that.
Yeah.
But the ESG side of that looks at what is Exxon doing to stave off climate change? What is Exxon doing to promote and recruit diverse talent and all of the various iterations of what that means? ESG is, at its heart, taking into consideration non-fiduciary matters. Now, advocates of ESG, including otherwise very serious people, will tell you that ESG is simply correlated with shareholder return. But that's by no means settled.
Yeah.
So what we do at Bowyer Research is we don't brand ourselves as an anti-ESG firm or an anti-DEI firm because for many reasons. One, it's very negative. We don't like having that kind of energy. But two, we're not fundamentally defined by, and I think conservatives and free market people more generally shouldn't be defined by what they're against. They're defined by what they're for, right? We are pro-excellence. We're pro-core business focus, right? We want ExxonMobil to do business in the energy sector because doing business in the energy sector creates money, creates jobs, and creates the financial future that ExxonMobil shareholders depend on, right? This has always been the model, right? There are kind of two models since we're on the subject of that. There is what's known as shareholder capitalism, right, which is whatever generates the maximal return within legal and ethical guidelines is the correct move for business. And then with the advent of what's known as the Business Roundtable, right, and there is this 2019 document called Statement on the Purpose of a Corporation. The Business Roundtable is a big nonprofit. They put out this statement. It got a great deal of attention at the time in 2019. And what that did was essentially introduced what's called stakeholder capitalism. So stakeholder capitalism is the idea that when corporations are making decisions, it's not enough to simply measure return, measure what creates maximal business success for the shareholder, for the benefit of the owner within legal and ethical constraints. You have to now take into consideration what are called stakeholders. And as so often happens, even with nobly intentioned corporate goals, the net of what counts as a stakeholder has been broadened a good bit, right? So what is a stakeholder, right? Let's take something. We'll stick with the ExxonMobil thing. What is a stakeholder to ExxonMobil? The environment, the climate to which ExxonMobil presumably contributes. All of these things now have to be taken into consideration in the ESG model as things that affect corporate decision making. And what we have seen over the past couple of years, really quite a long time, right? So the segue into how we got into talking about the DEI thing was after we were done rapping.
Yeah.
Dan is like, well, so once DEI kind of goes away, it's not going away, but like once DEI is kind of faded out of the headlines, you do still have a job, right? And I'm like, yes, because the rise of environmental, social, and governance initiatives in business, specifically ones that threaten a business's ability to act in accordance with its fiduciary duty, those have been embedded for a very long time. Those aren't going anywhere as quickly as DEI, because this is the problem. The issue with a lot of corporate DEI policies was that they were adopted, we could say flippantly, I think more accurately, we could say insincerely.
Mm-hmm.
And so they can be discarded in many cases very insincerely too. We can see this kind of happening with Target right now. And you can go back and listen to the other podcast if you want to hear us break down the Target situation. The problem with ESG is that it's not nearly as insincere because it's been around longer. And the notion of stakeholder capitalism has permeated corporate policy across sectors, right? So you go and look at, I won't name the company, but you look at a major financial institution's sustainability policies. What does that mean? Well, it means you're taking into consideration emissions reductions at all scopes, right? Scope 1, which is direct, Scope 2, which is slightly more indirect, and then Scope 3, which is incredibly broad. It's like to the point of, like, I flew on a plane to come here. Does that count as part of Acton's Scope 3 emissions?
Yeah.
And is reducing that somehow something that Acton needs to be devoting time to if Acton were like a publicly traded company? That's the kind of calculus that we're dealing with. So that's kind of a primer to ESG. There are a lot of other issues, right? That we talked about the environmental, the social stuff. The social stuff, DEI is definitely part of the social, the S in ESG. The governance stuff is a little bit more complicated, right? So there's a lot of, this is shareholder rights. How do shareholder meetings work? Who can call them? How many shareholders have to, or what percentage of shareholders have to be involved to force special meetings? That's a separate issue. We can talk more about that if you'd like.
Yeah. When you were looking at this for the first time, because you've done a lot of writing and reporting on this in a lot of different companies, when did you start reporting and what got you interested in this as a beat that you're interested in covering? Like, it's obviously like these sort of guidelines are things that large pension funds make decisions based on, a lot of businesses make decisions on, but also like a lot of investment groups of investors put pressure on companies to do this sort of thing. So there's like a lot of angles that you can learn about it from. What were those angles for you, and what got you thinking, this is something worth spending some serious time on?
Yeah, part of the thing that really helps with that is the fact that I'm not primarily a journalist on these angles, right? So I work for a corporate engagement firm. Our clients are shareholders in publicly traded companies, from Exxon to JP Morgan Chase to IBM, PepsiCo, the whole Fortune 500 essentially. And what we do is, if you own stock in a publicly traded company, you have certain rights as a shareholder. One, to vote, which is the most fundamental right as a shareholder because you own shares in the company. And the second one, which we have utilized to great success, is if you own a certain threshold of stock and have held it for a certain period of time, you can put a proposal on the ballot, and it can be voted on by shareholders at a company's annual meeting. Now that, you may look at that and think, well, that's not that big of a deal, right? Most shareholder proposals probably don't pass. And you're right, they don't pass. But the reality is shareholder proposals are a tremendously good way to get direct interface with a company that shareholders own, right? So the concept of, it's funny, you think about that whole kind of Gen Z boomer approach to getting a job. It's like, well, son, you just go down to the McDonald's and you like pound your fist on the counter and you say, I want a job, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
There's kind of that. I don't want to say that's the motif of what we do, but there's a concept of if you own stock directly in a company and you have concerns about the way that company is making its decisions, especially in terms of how it's prioritizing non-fiduciary elements, you have, one, a right as a shareholder to be concerned about that, and two, there is a defined process by which you as a shareholder can make those concerns known. This is a very niche thing. A lot of investment advisors do not pay attention to this sort of thing, right? So there's two sides of this, right? There's the shareholder engagement side, which is the proposals and all of the various filings that go along with that. And there's the actual voting on the proposals, which is known as proxy voting. That's a whole separate thing. Another thing that is another fairly niche area of thinking about finance. But the reason I got involved in this was twofold. And I guess we'll talk about a little bit about how I got this job.
Yeah.
They're like, well, you're 23. Why do you have this job? Fair enough. So my plan in college was broadly to be a journalist, right? Mm-hmm. Came in, wanting to be a lawyer. The grades were not lawyer grades. So it's like, all right, we're not going to do that. Freshman year, that was abundantly clear. So I wanted to be a journalist. I enjoy writing. I've interviewed a lot of very interesting people during my college career as a journalist, right? We talked to, executioners on death row, refugees in Ukraine, expats from Hong Kong who were targeted by the Chinese Communist Party, right? And that was all really fun. And that was very enjoyable to me. And I like storytelling. It's a fundamentally interesting, compelling art. But it's not making the same impact. So I could have brought a list here. We can pull out a list of corporate policies that have been changed in the past year because of the impact that shareholders have had through Bowyer Research. We can point to specific policy guidelines and commitments to political neutrality that wouldn't exist if we hadn't been there. There's a big difference between doing that and writing a piece. I enjoy writing a lot. I enjoy writing many things. But to be able to point to tangible impact, especially as a young person in politics, it is very, very difficult to find an industry where not only you can have a tangible impact, but you're more incentivized to do the thing than talk about how someone else should be doing the thing. That was a real change for me.
And that's a real trap that you could fall into as a writer. So, what are you doing when you're having these conversations? Yeah. Oh, well, I'm raising awareness.
Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? Like,
you mentioned the investment advisor angle of all this, right? So there are a great many nonprofits that are publicly very anti-ESG, and they'll do whole conferences about ESG, and they'll do press releases, and they'll do events, and they'll do lectures about how ESG is bad. How are their investments being voted? Are they being voted in accordance with the will of that nonprofit that truly cares about fiduciary duty, or is that duty being outsourced? Because the reality is most people do outsource that, because if you own direct stocks, you cannot be bothered. And you shouldn't be. You have a day job that's something else. You can't be bothered to file through every stock you own and vote all the proxies. You outsource that. The problem is many institutions in America have outsourced that voting. They've outsourced that financial stewardship, the fundamental element of their financial stewardship, to people who don't share their values at all. This is kind of a crude analogy, and by crude I mean not a particularly great one, not inappropriate. Mark's about to freak out and pull the mic.
Mark's usually egging that on.
That's right. He's just like, please, give me something. Imagine that electoral voting worked that way. So instead of you go to the polling place, you fill out your ballot, you put it in, that's the end of it. Voting is so complicated that you have to pay someone else to go to the polling place, fill out your ballot, and put it in the box. Again, it's a crude analogy. You can pick apart analogies. No analogy is perfect. But just think about that as a concept. you would want to be somewhat careful that that person shares your values. Because I don't know about you, but if I see, how should we put this nicely, a barista from Palo Alto with a I Heart Bernie and fossil fuels are literal races and bumper stickers on her car, she's probably not going to be the person I trust to fill out my ballot on my behalf. She doesn't share my values. And yet, how many organizations in America have outsourced their financial stewardship to asset managers who are as divorced from their values as I am from that barista? And that's a real problem. The amount of nonprofits that we're seeing taking this seriously now is fantastic. And the amount of companies and groups that are really digging into this under-discussed, underutilized resource of aligning your finances with your values, it's a big deal.
This is something that you've seen for a long time with, I've met with people who are like investment managers who will, let's say, they have a fund that invests in stocks that they have some metrics to show that they're in line with the values of, let's say, the teachings of the Catholic Church or that sort of thing. And that's one aspect of this, but this is very different because this is
which interpretation of the teachings of the Catholic Church? Do we mean the super progressive one? Well, I'll give you an example, right? I'm going to give you a story, right?
Yeah.
So this is an ongoing saga with Bowyer Research, but one of the things that we do through corporate engagement, besides putting proposals of our own on the ballot and putting forth initiatives of our own, is combating anti-fiduciary initiatives from other activists, right? So outside of ESG considerations in corporate policy, which is certainly a thing, there's also obviously an activist wing. There are activist organizations that don't actually own the stock. They borrow the stock to put the proposal on the ballot, which is not particularly principled ownership, but that's a separate thing. One of the most pernicious ones that we've seen recently has been activists saying to companies like Lockheed Martin and Intel, I wrote about this at the Daily Wire.
Yeah, this is a great
This
piece.
whole thing of we need to divest from Israel. Why? Human rights concerns. What does that mean? Well, it means human rights concerns. We're concerned about human rights in a very concerned manner that involves human rights. Okay, well, that doesn't really mean too much. Where do you think those activists come from? Are they pro-Hamas elements? Is it like some Columbia student group? Just kidding. They've never had enough money to do any of this sort of thing.
Yeah.
No, it's Catholic groups. It's the Sisters of St. Francis. Put a proposal on Lockheed Martin's ballot for 2 years in a row, saying that Lockheed Martin, or implying that Lockheed Martin should remove a 20-year-long partnership that it's had with the State of Israel because of human rights violations, as opposed to saying that not only is it very fiduciary for Lockheed Martin to have a business relationship with Israel, but using your influence as a shareholder to say that American companies should be actively working to disarm Israel in the war against Hamas. That's a tragic thing. That's a very slippery thing. And it's doubly sad that it's coming from people who are Christians.
So this is something that, and this gets to another interesting element of this, because there are people that, let's say Quakers, who it's just like they are out of their religious convictions. There's one way that, one way to act as let's say a Quaker in the world who has a peace testimony is to say, I'm not going to invest in Lockheed Martin.
Sure.
But then there's another thing, which is I'm going to invest in Lockheed Martin with the intention of changing Lockheed Martin into, let's say, a tennis ball manufacturer instead of someone who provides defense technology. Unpack like the moral difference there for us, because I think those things are different.
Correct.
And I think they're different in an important way. And I think one is principled and is a principled way to sort of bear witness in the world to your own commitments. The other
is less so.
Is less so. And you've seen how this works.
Yeah, we run into this argument all the time because this kind of hits at the edges of the boycott question, right? Mm-hmm. So Bud Light, Target are the most prominent examples of this. Is boycotting the solution that principled people should, whether they're conservative, religious, or otherwise, is that a solution that we should be going with? And our position has always been, we're a corporate engagement firm. We believe in engagement, not retreat. And our point is, if you have an issue with the way a company is doing something, so let's say you have an issue with debanking, right?
Yeah.
You're a shareholder at JP Morgan Chase and you have a problem with debanking. This happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you use the tools of shareholder engagement to talk to the company and say, debanking people based on political ideology is not being politically neutral as a company. It's damaging to the brand and it should stop. That's very different from saying JP Morgan Chase shouldn't be a bank. Right? These are fundamentally different things.
Okay.
So, and also, but to your point about the boycott thing,
Yeah.
there are two options when it comes to dealing with a bank that's debanking, that you believe to be debanking people based on political reasons. You could divest, you'd sell off all your stock and be like, I'll never bank at JP Morgan again, whatever. Or you're a shareholder. You could use the influence that you have to do something. Because unfortunately, boycotts very often are basically a tactical version of picking up your ball and going home. And unfortunately, advocates of fiduciary duty, advocates of market success, right? Unfortunately, we have a bad track record of picking up our ball and going home on these sorts of issues. And that is how people who didn't care about fiduciary duty, people who see ESG as a better thing as opposed to core business, that's how they captured the boardroom. They used the avenues of shareholder advocacy, of pressure, to pressure executives into agreeing to things that were never fiduciary. And because there was no countervailing force from the people who would say, political neutrality matters, don't take sides on abortion, you're a toy company. Why are you promoting abortion? You're a toy company. Why are you promoting something that kills future customers? Like, what's wrong with you? Also, don't take sides on contentious political issues. It's not your job. Those people were deprived of their voice at the table. And that's how a company shifts left, right? There's all these kinds of questions about how do we get to all of this woke capitalism? Lots of reasons. But one that we kind of got behind the eight ball on was that we left. We kind of assumed that the free market would always be the free market and everything would kind of go okay because economics are good, and they are. But we left that playing field open for a bunch of activists who don't have corporations' best interest in mind to take over. And we are a decade behind the curve, 2 decades behind the curve when it comes to undoing all the damage that's been done.
So part of this is there's a duty of people to responsibly steward what they have. Having cows involves having the care of cows.
That's right.
And there are a lot of investors who have shares and they've been disengaged. They have just been letting these companies, executives, run the companies how they see fit, letting other shareholders who have been organized in activist ways put pressure on firms to change policies in ways that compromise the fiduciary duty of these firms.
Yeah, and the way that gets painted is, well, isn't this just corporate activism for the right? Well, let's take another example. Let's take the example of the Human Rights Campaign, which is an oddly named organization. The Human Rights Campaign is a nonprofit that uses its tremendous influence to push corporations to do profoundly unfiduciary and immoral things, such as covering the provision of puberty blockers for employees' children in their healthcare plans in the name of healthcare equality, this sort of thing. Hundreds of businesses have complied with these sorts of activist demands. When you're looking at the question of, isn't this just corporate activism for the right? Isn't this just like a right-branded conservative corporate activism? You have to ask the question, well, is it fundamentally the same thing to say you should partner with this organization that wants you to advance egregiously divisive, non-fiduciary, non-business related social causes through its policies? Is it the same thing to say you should partner with this activist org, as opposed to saying, no, you shouldn't do that. Because our answer is not, you should partner with a right-wing activist org. The answer is, you shouldn't partner with activist organizations. Because political neutrality is the answer to these sorts of things. The thing that we get hit with a lot is it is said.
Yeah.
It is said. We'll just use the
Many are
the
saying.
evasive. Some, yeah. Mm-hmm. The evasive passive.
Yeah.
Mistakes were made. If you're a real Chris Christie nerd, you know what we're talking about, right? Unfortunately, a lot of people are going to get that reference. Actually, it's like it's a political podcast. You're my people. I understand.
When you face criticism, oftentimes it's
that's
just
right.
you're trying to stop
To do a right-wing
certain
version
partnerships.
of what? Yeah.
Now, the one place where I see this is maybe I wonder.
It's definitely true for some people.
Well, I wonder about. So, what if a firm finds out, for instance, that by debanking certain people, they get better returns to shareholders? Let's say because there are these immense sort of social pressure, boycott movements, these, you have, the light version of this is like the Twitter mob. The actual, the actual heavy version of this is like actual mobs.
That's right.
And what happens if, there's a bank, they have a fiduciary responsibility for shareholders. Mm-hmm. Let's say they have someone who's banking with them that they debank because of their
legitimate
sort of odious political opinions or support for sort of regimes in the world that violate human rights and potential financial ties. Like there's all sorts of things that are political that are also like could potentially return compromised shareholder value. Like that's not a simply, okay, don't focus on these things, focus on shareholder value. But when you're saying you want to create a sort of like protected class of speech that like people could refuse customers based on, let's say, creditworthiness, other things for fiduciary duty.
Or whether they do business in crypto.
Or whether they do business in crypto.
Yeah, I don't think
is that a political statement though? Or is that a bank trying to
or is that a risk question?
Cover themselves from potential liability?
Yeah, some of this is just a practical observation that the people who are being debanked are by and large not being debanked because they support Iran.
Yeah.
They're, what's left of Iran, right? We can keep that in. The people who are being debanked are folks like Indigenous Advanced Ministries, which is a Christian nonprofit that works in Uganda, was debanked by Bank of America over accusations that it's a debt collector. It's never collected debt. It's a Christian nonprofit that helps widows and orphans, right? If we come to a point where people are being debanked for, I don't know, supporting the Democratic Party, we'll just paint some weird right-wing dystopia where that happens. It's so far afield from the current state of who gets debanked in America, but we'll just take it there for a minute. Yeah, that's not fiduciary either.
So do these debankings, in your experience for covering this, seeing how these work, are these usually motivated by activist constituencies that target
debanking?
Certain organizations, certain individuals, bring them to the attention of these banks with...
It's a good question.
Yeah.
So because of certain provisions in the Bank Secrecy Act, there is an element of this that you can't totally know for sure.
Yeah.
Because there is a sense in which banks can't completely tell you the reason why they debank you, which is an interesting provision. We can talk more about that if you'd like.
Which maybe makes this
it makes
easier to abuse.
It does, right? So if you have a nebulous explanation of, we've determined that your risk profile is too high.
Yeah.
Well, what have you done recently? Well, you ran a nonprofit.
Yeah.
You ran a Christian nonprofit that serves widows and orphans. Or when a majority of the cases around debanking seem to have to do with A, people of a certain political inclination, 2, people of a certain, I don't even want to say certain religious affiliation. There have been plenty of instances of debanked Muslims. There's an excellent piece at the Free Press about it. But when it comes down to this sort of thing, the question is, when you don't have a guarantee, go back to the JP Morgan Chase example, right? Because this was an example from this year. So JP Morgan Chase several years ago debanked Ambassador Sam Brownback. It was a massive story, right? And the question is, well, did they debank him because he happened to start a nonprofit that was religious in nature, right? That was a question. And JP Morgan Chase actually, it was really the gold standard in terms of how a company should handle this. They basically said, we made a mistake. And this year, wrote about this at the Daily Wire too, they put in an express prohibition against debanking based on political opinion. See, that matters. Even if, because the Bank Secrecy Act is not going to change, right? That part doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It's about what you're signaling. When you're signaling that we understand that this just happened with Citibank too, right? When you understand that there are concerns about people being debanked for political views that are inconsistent with certain zeitgeists, shall we say, that tend to lean politically left. When you say that we are sensitive to those concerns and therefore we are making an express guarantee that we are not going to debank you based on your political belief, that doesn't mean that the bank throws out all the risk analysis, right? That doesn't mean you can never debank anyone again, right? See, this is an argument that we get into on a lot of things, right? It's the role of business analysis versus activist pressure. Lots of examples of this, most of them not really having to do with banks all that much.
Yeah.
But as a general rule, when it comes to risk, when you have the proper safeguards and you have the proper guarantees in place, Citi is still going to have a debanking policy. JP Morgan Chase still has a debanking policy, right? Our position is not that you shouldn't have a debanking policy. That wouldn't be fiduciary.
Yeah.
Because then you don't have a fail-safe for someone who genuinely is worthy of being debanked for a variety of reasons. That's why the signaling matters. Because when it comes to being able to see the vibe shift that has happened over the past couple of years in corporate America, especially over about the last two, there are going to be really two models of what corporations do there. There is accept that these weird shifting sands of right-wing cultural dominance, whatever, left-wing cultural dominance, the easiest way to alleviate alleviate the brand damage that can come from getting involved in those is political neutrality, to not take a stance on these sorts of things. And then there will be brands like Costco that just decide there's a flag plant there, right? And there are quite a few corporations that are flag planting. We'll see how it goes.
So there are historically these firms. Ben & Jerry's is the famous example. I remember this showing up in my sort of junior achievement economics textbook in high school. As Ben & Jerry's is a company that is founded, and now it's no longer independent and it's owned, and there's all sorts of things about it. But there are these companies that part of their identity and their founding is that we're not about fiduciary duty. There's a whole class of there's ways you can incorporate legally.
Is definitely the key example of this.
Yeah, that sort of.
Although I will say on the Ben & Jerry's front, very quickly, right? So Ben & Jerry's, when it comes to its relationship with Unilever, and when it comes to its relationship with its shareholders, it's been a very, very rocky relationship. Ben & Jerry's relationship with its shareholders, when it comes to some of the stances its founders have taken on certain issues that have to do with a certain area of land in the Middle East, have led to legal action. It becomes a question of, will you make part of your brand around making these kinds of really forthright political stances? And it gets us in a lot of trouble. We don't love that. That's a very crude summation of what the legal action surrounding that has been. But it is a real question. I want to kind of address this, right? Because when it comes to engaging companies and negotiating for policy changes via shareholder advocacy, there are different ways to go about it depending on the company. Like, we talk to Starbucks very differently than we talk to Tractor Supply, because these are completely different companies. They have very different customers. Now, the interesting thing about a lot of companies like Tractor Supply, John Deere may be the most prominent example of a company that's really, y'all could stand to do better, corporate politics that are completely out of line with its customer base. What's up with that? That's strange. Now, when it comes to something like Starbucks, the question is not so much you might be divorced from your customer base, because when you think about, go back to Palo Alto, think about the barista, right? Maybe their core customer base does want to do anti-fiduciary things. It's by no means clear that, by the way, even if its core customer base likes the divisive social stuff, it's by no means clear that the bona fide best way to maximize shareholder return is to lean into doing more of that. When even with companies that are left coded, we could say, there are certain elements of neutrality that are non-negotiable. So, like, for example, one argument we have with companies, regardless of how they're politically coded, is what's called an employee gift match policy. Mm-hmm. So a lot of companies do this. They'll match employee gifts to a variety of eligible 501c3s. A lot of them have bizarre prohibitions on religious nonprofits being part of that. And the question has to come up, why, right? Because even if you're the most left-wing coded company, whatever, you still have to provide a reason as to why donating to secular institutions of higher learning, like Kiwanis Club, whatever, why that's totally fine, but donating to religious organizations has to be blocked out, or is only allowed if it also serves a secular purpose. Why is that? That's weird. I don't think those are the divisive stances that are really winning people over. And aside from that, there are some real questions when it comes to your treatment of religious employees in the workplace. Why don't they have freedom of philanthropy? And if they don't, and if you're specifically not giving it to them because they're religious, well, that just became a much bigger question, especially for a publicly traded company.
So when you're trying to do this sort of, you're both raising awareness and it's a call for action, and there's methods for individuals to get involved as shareholders to exercise their own responsibility. There's also a large class of investors that aren't just normal everyday people, like state pension funds,
right,
like sovereign wealth funds,
mm-hmm,
like the state of Norway owns a lot of stuff. They own the sovereign wealth funds in places like Singapore, in Saudi Arabia. They own considerable amount of shares in publicly traded companies all around the world. Those aren't. How do you deal with that sort of reality where there's a large class of investors that aren't just, people who might have convictions that they want to see, are, they might have convictions that are at odds with certain things that they see as not conducive to producing shareholder value. But a lot of these state actors have other interests than just returning shareholder value.
I think about the New York City Carpenters Pension Fund.
Yes.
It's one of the most, there are a lot of state pension funds involved in the world of shareholder activism, almost all of which, all but one, arguably are non-fiduciary. The only one that isn't happens to be a Bowyer Research client, right? The Oklahoma Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust. Mm-hmm. The reality is, state pension funds have a ton of weight, both when it comes to the amount of shares they own, and two, the amount of money that they have that is being leveraged and influenced via proxy votes, right? So the issue that we're seeing now is that a lot of state pension funds, even states that are generally run by very anti-ESG, pro-fiduciary, really solid people, the way the funds are voted does not match that. That's an issue. Right, so let's take the Oklahoma Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust. We call it TSET. Right, it's one of the biggest wins we've seen this year in the corporate engagement world. They're actively taking steps into the shareholder engagement arena. They're pushing for neutrality at companies like Lululemon, at Alphabet, Google, Netflix, these kinds of companies. Blue states have been more than willing to throw their weight around on behalf of all kinds of initiatives that are non-fiduciary for years. And red states have historically not done so. Only recently, this goes back to that whole question of how we're a decade behind the pro-ESG wing of the advocacy world. I think there's a world in which a lot of red state pension funds and a lot of fiduciaries in red states understand that the issues that are being foisted on companies and the activism that's being foisted on companies affects them directly. I'll give you an example of something that's really emerging right now. This is some really tip of the spear stuff in terms of what we're seeing like this week on the corporate ballots, right? There's literally this week, I think Thursday, there'll be one on Kroger's annual ballot that's in this wheelhouse. It's what's called the war on food, right? So there's a lot of ESG-aligned activists who are very, very upset at food production companies, at agriculture companies, for producing food, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So there becomes that question of, one, why aren't you complying with the guidelines of the World Health Organization, right? Complying guidelines, that's kind of an odd thing. Shouldn't that be guidelines, kind of good business analysis always? No, apparently not, right? There's this whole movement afoot to decrease the amount of food that can be affordably produced to fit activist goals. That affects everybody.
Yeah, Sri Lanka banned genetically modified foodstuffs and induced a famine nationwide.
Right, and that's Sri Lanka, which
years.
notably, I don't know how many geographers are here, but like not a large country. If America does that, ironically, the term to be used for that is we're cooked. It's ironic because we're cooking a lot less, if that happens. But you know who really needs to care about that, or who really does care about that? Red states, ag states, should care and do care, and increasingly are becoming very, very concerned about the fact that all these anti-agricultural mandates are being pushed by non-fiduciary activist elements. I think we're going to see a lot more pushback from red states on that issue, because that's one of those issues that affects everybody, unfortunately.
So how does that look different from, mobilizing shareholders on an individual level, bringing to their attention these things that are happening, getting in contact with them, getting them a game plan and, some method of coordination behind pushing back on this. That's very different than like getting into state legislators, getting into governors, getting into state bureaucracies. Because a lot of this isn't the governor of state X that's managing this.
It's not even always the treasurer. Right?
Yeah.
So
it's some department.
There are treasurers involved.
Buried under the treasurer.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, and this is something, there's a great piece at Daily Signal by Rich Todd, who's the CEO of Innovest Portfolio Solutions. Mm-hmm. Great guy. We'll put a link in the show notes or
Absolutely.
something.
I'm writing
The hinge point of all this is the consultant for the vast majority, because you can be a red state fiduciary, but if the consultant is ESG aligned, you're going to have problems because they will oppose you at every step. We've seen this happen many, many times. But to the point about, yes, it's not just state legislatures, right? If red states have been as bold as blue states are, and red states use their influence for things that are much more in keeping with core business, much more in keeping with fiduciary duty, I think the current amount of corporate politicization we have right now would be significantly less. Because the thing we say to companies, especially to companies that are friendly, because there are a lot of companies that are by and large receptive to these sorts of things. We've worked with many this year even. And the argument we use partially is you're getting pushback from activists on the left. You're getting pushback from shareholder advocates on the right. The best option here is for you to not take positions on this sort of thing. And if we can help you by being a counterbalance to that sort of thing, to say, no, in fact, we won't make net zero commitment by a net zero commitment by 2040. If it just takes a balance of advocacy on both sides to get a company to walk back or to just not make a commitment to something that's not fiduciary, that's good enough for us.
is there anything that consumers can do on the level? There's the sort of Marxist philosopher Slavoj Žižek makes this great joke about how,
Please say it more clearly than he said it.
yeah, you go and you buy the Starbucks coffee, and it says on the thing that it's responsibly sourced, recycled, paper only. So like you've bought not only the indulgence, but the absolution for the indulgence.
Yeah.
They come, it's the chocolate laxative. It's the combination of, the thing that causes the constipation also provides the relief. And there's sort of like, there's a pathological way in which consumers behave to try to excuse themselves. And I think a lot of conspicuous consumption people forgive themselves of because they're like, oh, well, they give so much to the United Way. Or, oh, they are aligned with these causes that I like. And that is an excuse for me to buy and indulge and consume. And companies notice that sort of behavior. And they this spectacularly backfired with Bud Light when they did their advertising. But the thought is we have a product that is declining in revenue year over year. We have a declining brand.
You know what'll work really
We have
well?
to find more consumers. No, but the impulse is you have to find more consumers.
I get that. Yeah.
And the exec and the person in charge of that marketing account, she was eventually let go. But you could see it's like, okay, does her career end with managing a declining brand forever? Or do you roll the dice and do something provocative that might stimulate interest, might not, but it'll make a splash either way. And a lot of people who are very sympathetic with radical left-wing causes, you'll gain a lot of career capital from them that even if you're let go with from Budweiser, somebody else will hire you because you did this thing that they see as courageous or innovative. But you have this, there's a certain extent to which a lot of this, you look at it and it's like, yes, this is transparently against the financial interests of the corporation. There's a lot of it that is like, it's very simple. You run the numbers and there's just money going out, money getting wasted, not going into the product, not going into the service to consumers, but just being siphoned off by activist groups. But there's other stuff where it's a marketing play. And they will bring out the spreadsheets and say, we're trying to grow an audience in this demographic, which we know cares about recycling, cares about, gay rights, cares about whatever the issue is. And they try to make that case by the numbers. How do you respond to that sort of thing? When it's like when the excuse is we're just playing to consumer desires. Ben and Jerry's knows its audience. And they're going after that audience. And the audience that is going to eat that pint of fish food is into this stuff. And if we stop doing it, maybe we lose business. Maybe those customers that want to conspicuously consume and justify it as a form of social activism, maybe they find another brand of ice cream to do that if we stop.
It's a good question.
Yeah, because I don't know the numbers.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's just this is advertising execs trying to sell an agenda.
They would never do that.
Or if
I understand what
what? Because there are those people. There is that Starbucks barista.
Totally.
And she's got that Bernie sticker and she's got money.
That's right.
Like she goes out and she spends and she goes out to eat and she orders bottled water and she does.
And uses Klarna to pay for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
All this sort of thing.
Like,
yeah, no, I think that's right. It's an interesting question, right? Mm-hmm. Because, Bud Light's kind of a separate thing because there's that question of, well, we're trying to expand our market. Well, you expanded your marketing demographic by completely alienating the other marketing demographic, right?
Accelerating the decline of a brand is not an answer.
Yeah, also, it's just marketing expansion and marketing replacement are two different things. And replacement's a real big gamble. And clearly in the case of Bud Light, it didn't pan out super well. But yeah, there is that question of what's the difference between corporate activism and advertising shenanigans, we'll call it that.
Yeah.
I think the Bud Light example there is pretty instructive, right? So if you have if you're looking at an advertising strategy and you bother to think, I wonder if any of this is going to alienate at least half of the country on either side, right? That's a real question. I think there are advertising ploys that are very innovative that don't do that. I think when it comes to advertising that specifically injects politics into the brand, that goes away very slowly because you've now anchored your brand to something that is not making cool phones. It's about struggling to think of an example here that's not horrifically inappropriate.
I mean, no, it's about identity.
Yeah.
It's about I'm this kind of person.
Yeah.
And I want to see this in the companies that I buy from. And you see right-wing folks do this all the time too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you see this, there's certain products, certain brands
I'm thinking of a very specific company here that I'll tell you once we're off air.
Yeah. But you have these folks, and it's like this becomes in a really unhealthy way. Like I don't think it's good for people to identify with products.
Yeah, it becomes a niche product.
But they do.
Yeah.
And it happens, and companies do trade on that.
Yeah. Well, there's that question of what is X advertising ploy? Is it going to turn a product that previously appealed to everybody into a kind of niche product that only appeals to people who, well, I like coffee, and I also, like Hamas, so I'll go to whatever coffee shop.
Yeah.
Not going to use a specific example for obvious reasons, right? Or I like coffee. Maybe one consumer really cares about Hamas. I don't know. Consumers exist. And another consumer really cares about some right-wing cause, whatever. And they can both go to the same coffee shop. If you were once that coffee shop, and then you turn into we only appeal to the Hamas-loving customers because of a marketing ploy, that's a real question. Because part of this comes down to, I think, how the right especially responds to being snubbed by corporations, right?
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of
we have
resentment.
this conversation a lot. A lot of conversations we have with companies, especially with really left-wing coded companies, is just explaining how conservatives handle that sort of thing, because it's kind of like an old bear kind of situation, right? You poke with a stick and it kind of doesn't do anything, and then you poke it again and it kind of just looks at you. Then you poke it again and it comes out and just cuts you up. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at that, people who are on the right tend to hold grudges for a real long time. I know people who didn't stop their Target boycott until a couple months ago when they announced DEI rollbacks, and they hadn't shopped at Target for 10 years, right? The left, at least the corporatist activist wing of the left, tends to be pretty transactional. You give us this signal, we'll keep shopping. Now, the unfortunate thing is that leads to goalpost moving, because you ask for one thing, they give it, so you come back the next year and you ask for more. That's another interesting thing that kind of differentiates.
How much of that is based on a different level of organization?
That's a good question. I think some of it is, right? So you look at the Human Rights Campaign, right?
Yeah.
So it goes from, you need to not discriminate against gay and lesbian folks in the workplace. Okay, we can all get behind that. Every single one of us who's not an insane person, right? And then it turns into, well, you need to have mandated trainings, which turns into, in order to be truly inclusive, you need to cover gender-affirming care, which turns into, in order to be truly inclusive, you have to cover provision of puberty blockers to children. That's goalpost moving, right? There's a huge difference in tactics between doing that and going to a company and saying, shareholders are concerned about the politicization of your services. We would like a guarantee of political neutrality in X area of policy. And then we'll go away, right? We're not going to come back next year with some And now you have to support X, Y, and Z right-wing causes
Yeah.
to further like prove your allegiance, fealty. We want you to have fealty to the money-making part of your business because that's what we all kind of care about. Because we're all literally invested, right?
Yeah.
The people who are coming to you are literally invested in your success. They're shareholders. They care. A lot of these people are not. They don't buy the shares to invest. They buy it so their kids can go to college, right? Like a lot of our clients are very normal people.
Yeah.
And that presents some interesting challenges, especially in terms of engagement and safety.
So how do you make sure institutionally? So you're doing this work. You're trying to establish this neutrality. You're trying to just lower the temperature of this stuff.
Yes.
But there are voices on the right that are like very interested in just copying the playbook and reversing
Well, they just want to
it.
burn stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they just
right.
the resentment's there, and it's very powerful. And there are reasons, the way that people have
Yes.
been treated, the way that people, they feel like they've been poked and
now
poked
they're ready
repeatedly.
to,
And now they're out for
The
blood.
bear is ready to bite chunks of flesh out of it, right? This is a real thing. And the way we handle that on the company side is, look, there's been a big vibe shift in this country. I don't know if you've noticed for the past 5 years, something has changed. And do you want to work with us? Because we're invested in your success. We want you to do well. We're not interested in punishing you for doing the wrong thing if you're willing to work with us and acknowledge that there's been some breach of trust here. Do you want to work with the people who say that? And by the way, who are all invested in your success and literally want your stock to go up by 1,000% because, of course, we all do? Or do you want to work with the people who want to just parade of shame your brand? Unfortunately, that happens on the left and the right because, well, there's a desire for revenge and grievance settling in all kinds of ways that's profoundly unhealthy. And our job is to, in part, not give in to that. Because, yeah, it's bad. There have been some, especially on the debanking front, there have been some debangings that are pretty brutal. There have been some ways that employees of faith have been treated that are pretty brutal. But we are professionals, right? And so some of that means we don't just want to... Part of the shareholder proposal process is the proponent gives a speech at the annual meeting. A lot of people just put a proposal on the ballot so they can give the speech at the annual meeting. That's not our way, right? We're not interested in taking up 3 minutes of company time just to yell at the board. We would prefer that we withdraw the proposal in exchange for a real conversation and some progress. Because at the end of the day, yeah, it's really fun to live rent-free in Larry Fink's head, CEO of BlackRock. It'd be way better if we had a real conversation with BlackRock, which we are having, by the way, right? There's a certain segment of this corporate engagement world that really just wants to yell and break stuff. But I seem to remember someone saying that the future belongs to the builders. I tend to agree with that. Because, one, these companies do a tremendous amount of good for a tremendous amount of people, right? So because we're at Acton, we can talk about something David Bahnsen said at Gilead's annual meeting of shareholders a couple months ago, right? Which you all should go listen to it. It's excellent. It's up at thebahnsengroup.com. We put it up on our podcast. It's great.
Yeah. And
he basically says Gilead has been an absolute maverick in terms of innovation in the healthcare space. We want it to keep doing that. Please don't throw it away for DEI. That's way different from saying that Gilead is woke and evil and no one should ever shop there again and it should burn. We're going to go with the former on that.
One of the things that commercial societies do is they transform people.
Yep.
They transform societies that they're people of various convictions that can live together and that can do and build great things together. And they don't have to have 100% alignment with everybody else to do that. But they can come together in all sorts of ways throughout an economy to build tremendous things that everybody can buy in on. And when you muddy those waters and you try to make every firm be everything to every person, that erodes the very foundation of a commercial society.
That's right. Because I think what a lot of people fundamentally want is they want everything they do in life to affirm their politics. Right? They want the social media algorithm does it automatically.
Yeah.
Right? You want your Twitter to reflect your politics. You want the shoes you buy to reflect your politics. You want the coffee you drink to support your politics. None of these things need to be validating your politics. Because the purpose of these institutions is not to validate your personal beliefs. It's to create success. It's to do good business things, right? This is about what is good for business, right? There's this whole business for good for business coalition effort going on right now, right? What is good for business in many ways is business for good, right? This is about creating the kind of success that builds people's financial future. And if you think that's not enough and it also needs to, or that can be supplanted by validating your own personal politics or being hurt because your own personal grievance feelings feel that way, I would suggest you might have some priority problems when it comes to what elements of society need to be remade to fit your feelings.
Well, Isaac, thank you for all your work and all your writing that's helping us keep our priorities straight and keep business oriented around making great products, offering great services, and building companies that return great value for their shareholders.
Thank you, man. I will just say, and you can keep this in if you want, we're in a moment right now where a lot of people are very confused on what markets actually do for people, whether they actually do create human flourishing. And it's always a privilege to be here at the Acton Institute around people who get that freedom and virtue both have to exist. And that one of the best ways to do that is by creating wealth for people, and to see that defended unapologetically here is one of the highlights of my year.
Thank you so much, Isaac. And thank you for all the work you do. Isaac was an emerging leader at Acton, and he was wonderful to have.
Terrifying.
When he was here as an emerging leader, and it's been wonderful to watch all the amazing work you're doing since then, and to see you take those ideas out into the world. So it's not just, the only reason, this is the reason that Acton does this.
Yep.
Is so that people like Isaac go out into the world. It's not to keep making Dan Hugers to keep doing what Acton does. Although I would like to keep
does
me
that
around.
Quite well.
Yeah. But the idea is to be a catalyst and to be a network and to bring people together and to motivate them to do great and amazing things. And you've certainly done that, Isaac. Thank you so much.
Man. Yeah. Would that we could have 1,000 institutions doing what Acton does, but none of them would do it as well.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.